Salisbury Museum is based in the medieval King's House in the Cathedral Close. And one of the challenges with having an old building is that it doesn't have a lot of space to store things. So over the years, the museum has become gradually full of things behind the scenes that we've amassed from the local area, in particular archaeology. Now, back in 2018, we decided to acquire an off-site store to collect basically more archaeological material amassed by organisations like Wessex Archaeology. It was also very useful because we could store a lot of larger objects that we don't have space for in the King's House. So let's go and have a look at one of them. So, this is the Scout motor car that was made in Salisbury in 1912. It is an unbelievably rare object. There are only two in existence, and we have one of them. Now, Scout Motors as a company was formed right back at the beginning of the 20th century by two gentlemen, Albert and William Burden. They were clock manufacturers in the later 19th century in Salisbury, but decided to go into manufacturing engines, at first for boats and also for motorbikes. They then formed a partnership with a man called Percy Dean, who was the money behind the operation, and went into making cars. We know that in 1905 they entered a car into the Isle of Man TT races, but unfortunately it didn't finish because it ran out of petrol. But this didn't stop them from becoming a really successful company in Salisbury. In fact, before the First World War, they were one of the largest manufacturers and industrial organisations in the city, employing a huge number of people. Their organisation, their company, actually moved to Churchfields, to where the site of Sydenham's is today. Let's have a closer look at the car. And one of the most remarkable things about this is how much original material there is on it. You can see, look, the original lights at the front there. It's got the original nameplate on the front of the engine there. Also lights back here, all powered by an acetylene generator that you can see sitting on that side of the car. Moving to the main part of it, you will see the leather, of course, is not original. It was re-upholstered back in the 1980s. But you've got original brass fittings, you've got this original wooden framework here on the screen. The hood stick's original, but of course the fabric here has also been replaced. So as I said, that's one of the really exciting things about it. There are a lot of original bits and pieces in the car. The paintwork, of course, has been restored, and that's something we'll come back to in a minute. But let's climb in and have a closer look. Now, I'm not going to drive it. The engine has been restored. It does run, but I'm not really up to the task. But when you get in here, one of the scary things is that there's nothing on the dashboard at all. There's no speedometer. There's nothing telling you how far the car has travelled. There is just a clock. That's it. You've got the accelerator, the brake, and the clutch. There is a gear stick in here. There's also a handbrake. But quite weirdly, they're on the wrong side. They get in the way if you want to climb out. So, a bit of a difficulty there, I would say. We do have some really interesting information about its history. So this is, in fact, its registration book from 1920. And it tells us that, in fact, the car was originally made in 1912 there. It says its registration number, AA4476. It says it was a touring-shaped vehicle. Now, Scout Motors used to describe these as a torpedo body, these cars. They were a four-seater car. It mentions that it was a dark green colour, so there's a clue there to its original colour. But it mentions also that it was chamois. We know that it was repainted in the 1950s, a kind of dirty brown colour. It was then taken back to the green colour in the 1980s. Scout is the type of car, it's the vehicle. Now, people think scouting has something to do with the organisation, the boys' organisation, which it doesn't. I think it's military as well. It has nothing to do with the military at all. It was just a popular name. It's the whole idea of taking something out, going exploring the great outdoors. I think that's where this idea, this brand came from. It was a very clever idea. Now, turning this over, we can see who owned it in the 1920s. So up here in 1925, there's a man called Charles Radford, who ran the Sunnyside Garage in Sanford Peveril in Devon. He owned the car then. It then passed in 1925 to a man called Edgar Jarvis, who lived in Higher Town, Sanford Peveril, and Sanford Peveril is just outside of Tiverton, just off of the M5 today. Now, we know that in the 50s, the car was scrapped in the early 50s, ended up in a scrapyard in Honiton, and a company called the Timmis Brothers in Yeovil, they bought the car off the scrap heap, and they sold it to a man called William Bond. or Bill Bond, who lived in Yeovil. Now, he completely restored the car and got it running again. He repainted it this chamois colour, and he entered it into rallies. So, for example, in 1953, he entered it into the coronation rally, which was to celebrate the Queen's coronation. And there are photographs kind of documenting that really important occasion. It then ended up being scrapped again. It ended up actually in the widow of Bill Bond's house. It got blocked up in her garage, and in the 1980s it was bought by a family locally called the Bailey family. They brought it back to Salisbury, and then they completely restored it from the ground or from the wheels upward. They stripped it all the way back to every nut and bolt, cleaned it all up, restored the engine. As I mentioned, they reupholstered it. They also repainted as well, looking at the colours that were in the original documentation, but also they found evidence of this Brunswick green actually on the bodywork underneath this chamois colour. So this was an incredible restoration. As I say, the car is unbelievably rare. They had it running again. They rallied it again in the 1980s. And we bought the car back in 2012 when it was 100 years old. And the point about this car is that it really is a symbol of Salisbury's industrial heritage. When people think of Salisbury today, they think of it as being a city in the countryside. They don't think of it having an industrial base. But it did. Before the First World War, in fact, going right back into the 19th, even the 18th century, there were local manufacturing businesses here. And Scout is really the epitome of that. It was a very successful organisation. The reason it failed eventually after the First World War is because, like a lot of small local businesses, the operating conditions at the end of the First World War were unbelievably difficult. Machinery had been requisitioned for the war effort, men had gone off to fight. It was almost impossible to rebuild businesses as a consequence of what had happened in the First World War. So unfortunately, a car like this, which wasn't mass produced but was completely made locally, it was very difficult to get an organisation like that off the ground, particularly when you had competition like Ford Motor Cars in America. So it failed, but still, it is a very important part of Salisbury's industrial heritage.